Okay, so in this video we're going over the very beginner level of operating your camera technically to expose your image, get sharp images, therefore get great colors and be in the best starting point before getting into Lightroom to edit your photos. Later on, you'll get more creative, capture iconic photos, but right now you just need to learn the technical know-how of capturing a high quality image out of your camera. So very beginner level, and we'll run through it very step by step. I wish I had something like this when I started, so I'll make some of these available to download in PDF form, save them on your phone, use them, study them. Like, I wish I had lots of examples of different situations, use these settings and stuff, so make it available for you guys. Okay, so the very first thing is exposure triangle. So we've got shutter speed, we've got ISO, and we've got aperture. So the exposure triangle, shutter speed, ISO, aperture, these are the three tools your camera uses to expose light hitting the sensor of your camera. So only three tools. It's a balancing act between these three tools to get the correct exposure in your image. And there is trade-offs to each of these tools that you have to be aware of that will break down, so they work in tandem with each other, but there is trade-offs to each, pros and cons, and every different lighting situation requires different shutter speed, different ISO, and different aperture. And because it's a triangle and a balancing act between all of them, if you make one adjustment to your ISO, you're probably going to have to adjust your aperture, so they're all affecting, they're a little bit intertwined, so it's a real mathematical balancing act to find the sweet spot for whatever it is you're shooting. Okay, so covering shutter speed first. So when you press the button to take a photo, a shutter slaps down, and depending on the speed of that shutter slapping down determines how much light got through to the sensor. So fast shutter, less light; long shutter, more light gets in before the shutter closed. So obviously really important for exposure, but shutter, where it's different from all the other tools, is it's also responsible for freezing action. So blurry photos, sharp photos, people moving, slow shutter here, so 2 seconds. If that shutter comes down really slow, by the time the camera is finished taking the photo, the subject has moved a long way. So really quick shutter, 1000 or something, it's going to come down really quick, and then it's going to freeze whatever was in line with the camera. No blur. Really important for sharp photos. How to use shutter later on, but that's what shutter is. So aperture is the iris of your lens. So this is really wide right now. So this is this one at the moment. This is 1.2. As you can see, f22, there is a very small amount of light getting through your lens. 1.4 or 1.2, there is a lot of light getting through the lens and getting to the sensor. So obviously very important for exposing your image, but where it's different from the other tools is depth of field, blurry background. So the iris works actually the same as your eyeball. If you're in the dark, your iris gets wider, so you can see in the dark a little better, and then in bright conditions, your pupils or whatever gets smaller, less light gets in. Depth of field, isolating your subject, blurry background, down here. And then landscapes, the whole image in focus from the front to the back, often landscapes and architecture up here. And I don't want to get sciencey about it, but like a wide iris, the wider the hole, it can kind of like see around your image. So you got to find the right aperture that exposes your image. So whether you want more light or less light, but then you're also figuring out how much of a blurry background, depth of field you want. So it also plays a really big role in sharpness of your images. Most lenses are sharpest around here, f16 to f11. If you're shooting with a prime lens, you might get away with f1.8 being pretty sharp, depending on the lens you've got. We will come back to aperture, how to use it, scenarios, when to use it, and how it works in combination with these other tools shortly. Okay, ISO. So ISO is like, I think of it as the computer in your camera. You've done the best you can with these two tools to let natural light into your camera, and then once this has gone as far as it can, it's time to let ISO, the little computer in your camera, help expose the image, try to give it a bit of a digital artificial brightening. The lower your ISO just means less light, so your image will get darker. You can bump it right up and you'll get a bright image, but then what happens is you get a very noisy looking image. So in general, the goal is to get a very low ISO, but we'll dive a bit deeper into it soon about like cameras are so good nowadays, you'll get away with 1600 pretty easily unless you're printing images really big. Okay, so that's the three tools your camera uses to expose the amount of light hitting your sensor to display your image. So real quick, just some examples like landscapes. You want to be shooting with an aperture up here, maybe landscape with a subject, maybe you're down here, or a low light. Portraits, people like to shoot down here for the blurry background, just showing people's faces with the background all blurred out. Fast action, you want to be shooting above 500 in your shutter. So if you're just shooting a person standing still, you should be okay with 100. Like birds flying is somewhere up here at 2000 if they're flying in the air. And then if you want blurry looking waterfall, it's somewhere down here with a really long, you could go 20 seconds. Stars is somewhere down here, 20 seconds to shutter, so the shutter closes really slow, and then you can get more light for the stars or more motion blur for the water, because more water will pass before that shutter closes, gets all the way down. And then if you want a blurry image of a car driving or a person running, you're looking around here if you want that dreamy creative style. And then ISO is really dependent on the environment, how much light there is, the quality of your camera. But during the day, people usually don't have to worry much about the ISO. It's usually around 800 to 100. And then at nighttime, when the sun goes down, blue hour, people are usually around here, where they're trying to really keep shooting even though it's getting really dark, and then you have to be very careful And then you have to start thinking about denoise in your camera around here, or in Lightroom, denoising it. These are just very vague, common scenarios, but it all changes in different lighting scenarios. The sun is set, all of a sudden you're shooting landscapes at f4 and not up here. You're shooting portraits at 1.4 because you need as much light as possible. If the sun is really low, there's blue hour, you might be shooting portraits at 150 because you need that light, and you might be shooting a portrait at 116 because you need that light. So just common rules that you'll see, but then you have to adapt to the amount of lighting, and then that's when you learn how far you can push your shutter speed. Because if you go too low and you're trying to shoot a person's face, they're gonna look blurry. Maybe you go get your tripod and you can get away with 1/50th of a shutter if your subject doesn't move too fast. So we'll just speed through some really common mistakes people make, or things to consider for each. A common mistake for ISO is not shooting high enough. So beginners are typically really worried about noise in their image. On Instagram, you don't notice noise it's gone, it's so small. Often beginners will keep their ISO at 200 or something. That means though they might have to shoot at a low shutter or a wide aperture to get more light, and now they've got a soft image and maybe an out of focus image and not tack sharp, because 1.8 isn't as sharp as say f4 in some cases. So they're sacrificing the benefits of these to get less noise, but in reality you're not really going to notice this as much as you think. But definitely experiment with what different ISOs look like. And one thing to note is, like, if you have a really noisy image, you can get rid of it a lot in Lightroom. A beginner kind of mistake is a too slower shutter speed, so they're shooting quite slow. The images have softness to them, so shutter speed too low. Understanding the difference between handheld and tripod, you can shoot a lot slower shutter speed if you have a tripod, because with a really slow shutter speed there's going to be a lot of movement before the shutter closes, but it's very dependent on the focal length you use. So if you're shooting at 16mm, it's very different to shooting at 200mm. So at 200mm you're really zoomed in. Like if you're using a telescope, like the tiniest movement you make creates a huge difference on the end of the 200mm. Where 16 you can be very handheld, there is less motion blur, but really zoomed in, the tiniest bit of movement creates a big movement at the end. So if you're shooting at 200mm, the rule is at a minimum shoot double, so at 400 or higher. Now there's good technology now with image stabilization and stuff, so it's not a rule exactly, but that's if you're shooting handheld. If you're shooting a tripod, you can shoot a lot lower with 200, but 16 you can get away with a very low shutter, especially if you're shooting a building that doesn't move, for example. You can shoot at very low shutters because 16mm you can just hold it and you don't get the effect of a really long zoom, the shake at the end. Sometimes people press the shutter and they move the camera, creating motion blur. You can set a timer delay or use a remote, use a tripod. So that's only if you're working with pretty low shutters. So it's sort of related to understanding the difference between motion of your camera and motion of the subject. If you're shooting a bike and you want the background of the bike to be blurry, then you're going to have to be in a car next to the bike to get a blurry background of the bike. So just keep in mind and think about, like, what's the difference between the camera having a lot of movement versus the subject having a lot of movement. There is a difference, they're not equal. common mistakes and tips for Aperture. So number one is probably people like to shoot down here because it gives a really blurry background. However, this means you can quite often miss focus of your subject, and like even if you just get the cheek instead of the eye, it can make a big difference. Your images look quite a bit softer even though you get a nice blurry background. Beginners really love this in general. Okay, let's take a look at this diagram. So they're all equal in their aperture, but 16mm, you have a thicker depth of field, so it's easier to hit the focus for your subject. And then 50, as you can see here, getting a little bit harder to hit focus of your subject. Say 200mm, it's gonna get very thin. It's such a fine, narrow depth of field here. But they're all the same aperture. So this person here could be walking up and down, moving around a lot, and it would be easy to hit focus. Not true for the 200mm. As for the background, so this would be a little bit blurry. This would be pretty blurry. The tree here would be very blurred out, and you wouldn't be able to see much of the tree here. But the tree here also is bigger than this one over here, than the 16, because of compression also. There's compression going on. So point being is the more you zoom, the narrower your focus depth, and therefore blurrier the background also. So just remember, there's a lot of situations where you don't want a super blurry background. You want multiple subjects. So let's say you're shooting a group of people. So you gotta fit multiple people. I would say at 16mm, I could shoot a group of people at 2.8. A group of people with 50mm, I would just go no lower than f4. 200mm, if I'm trying to shoot a group of people, you will want to shoot at about f8 maybe at the lowest, and then the f8 will increase your depth and you'll get everyone in focus. And just remember, as the subjects come closer to the camera, the thinner your depth of field, even if the aperture stays the same. So maybe you want to shoot a group of people, but your depth of field is too shallow. Well, then maybe you have to get further away from the subjects. Either the camera comes back or the subjects go back, and then you have a thicker depth of field, and you can fit everyone and get them nice and sharp. Up here is like, it's a nice balance between sharpness and depth of field, blurry background.
Course is and why it would be the right fit for you. What Martin has done that is so unique here is just gathered all these different creators. And
hello everyone, this is Ricardo speaking. I am very honored to be selected as one
and encourage you in some way to chase a dream and share it with them.
And with Aperture, it's really important to understand your glass. In general, every zoom lens, your sharp 16 to 11 is the sharpest. And mistake number 3 or so is, this is bad. At f22, you get something called diffraction. You'd think this is very sharp, but you're better off shooting down here at 16 to 11. f22, yeah, it's a strange thing that happens when you shoot really closed like that. Image starts to get soft. And a big reason of using Aperture is to just control the depth of field, blurry background, what is in focus, what's out of focus. And again, if you're shooting with 100mm, it really changes the blurriness and the focus depth of your image. So if you have multiple subjects it's hard to get everything in focus if you're really zoomed in at 100 or 200. So you might be shooting with 100mm at f4 or f11 and you're still getting like a blurry background. You might not want that blurry background, you want the background in focus, but because you're shooting so long, this gives a look a lot like this. Not exactly, it is quite different, but if you get what I mean, where the more you zoom, the blurrier the background also, in simple terms. Let's say if you're shooting at 16mm, 20mm, and at 11mm, everything will be in focus pretty easily. But at 200mm, f11, you won't get the whole image in focus. And that's where you might want to focus stack, but I mean, I've never done that before, but you can do that. So we'll go over 3 scenarios now. Most commonly, how do you think about these? Which one do you start with? Which one do you prioritize? So most common, if you have lots of light, and then in low light, how you think about these. So most commonly, where I start is maybe shutter speed, and I will just pick a shutter speed that is pretty fast and just lots of wiggle room, or like lots of room for error. It's plenty fast for whatever I'm shooting. And then I'll go for aperture, because aperture I find is where you get the most creativity. Like, it changes your image the most. All 3 of these add more light, but aperture affects light, depth of field, and it plays a big role in sharpening. So that's 3 things. Shutter is just sort of light and blur, or not blur. ISO is just light. So aperture affects a lot more. It's also what I like to focus on because it gives the most creative control to your photos. The playing with the depth of field. I'll take multiple photos of the same photo at different apertures, but shutter speed, I just want a sharp photo. So whether I shoot at 2000 or 100, I just want my photo sharp. I hardly ever do this blurry. It can be dreamy, it can be good for weddings and stuff like that, photographing cars and bikes, and you want that motion blur, but I haven't done that much. Most 99% of the time I'm up here in the shutters. So once I've chosen my shutter, I've got the aperture I want, I will choose my ISO if I need to get more light or less light. So ISO last, shutter first, and then aperture in the middle, because I'm going to play around and bounce between these for creative decisions. And then I just want a sharp photo. So that was most of the time, majority of the time. So yeah, it's sort of how I think: shutter to aperture to ISO most of the time. So another thing I'll commonly do, and what lots of people do, is say there is lots of light. You're in a building, tons of light, plenty to work with. I might chuck my ISO up high, and you might think that's really high and your image is really overexposed. So then I'll choose a really fast shutter to make sure it's dark enough, and then I will choose my favorite f-stop. I like f4 the most. So what this does is now I can be like, I want to shoot at 1.8, see what that looks like. So then I get more light, and now my image is probably overexposed, so I've got to lift the shutter to say 2000 to compensate, but that's all I need to do. I don't have to move the ISO because I've just moved the shutter. The difference between 2000 or 500 or 1000 is the same. If you're shooting a person, portraits, it doesn't matter. And the benefit of this is that I only have to worry about aperture, and I'm just changing my shutter on with the wheel. As long as I don't go below 100, I'll be fine. I can just move the wheel. There's no extra noise coming in. There's nothing I have to worry about. And then ISOs like 800 and 1600 you don't really notice on Instagram. 1600 is getting a little high. You don't really see it, but if you're doing billboards or printing your photos, it might be different. But this just really frees you up to just think creatively with your aperture and not have to bounce between all three of these just to expose your image right. You've got this buffer of all of this is not noticeable, all of this is not noticeable, but all of this is, and that's what I want to bounce around in and have creative control over. Yeah, that's the scenario if you've got tons of light and you want to keep things simple. All gets very important to understand in low light. So in low light, the difference between 50 and 20 can be the difference from a usable photo or not. So in low, same with your apertures, you're probably shooting down here in very low light. You've got your ISO up here. So you're really hitting the limitations of your camera. And if you go too far in any of these, you might ruin your photo. So this is where you have to really understand the camera. So a mistake someone might make in really low light is they keep shooting up here at, say, a fast shutter, and they're shooting at 1.4. Now 1.4, you're risking a soft looking image, you're risking missing focus in low light because it's hard to hit focus in low light. You maybe were just better off lowering your shutter speed, holding the camera really still. As long as you're using a lens 35 or something and you're holding it really still, then you might have been able to shoot at a high f-stop, get a really sharp looking image. We're at 2.8, sharper image, better focus, and then maybe you could have maybe lowered your ISO. But yeah, you'll learn your limitations over time and how much you can get away in editing, and then that's what we'll get into now. Okay, since editing is more important than ever and technology is so good now that a lot of this is irrelevant, it's all becoming editing and having a good style and making your photos look good in post. In 2024 and 5 and so on, going to be what everything is about because gear is so good now. Everyone wants the unique style. So sharpening in post, I think denoise, color denoise, texture, clarity, sharpening, like clarity and texture, it gives the appearance, it can give the appearance of sharpness. Most people over sharpen their images, and then also just contrast in your image can give the appearance of a more sharper image. So after watching so many guest editors, they all do different approaches in sharpening and texture and clarity, and it's very, very interesting. Like I remember Emma really increased the texture. It was really surprising. But yeah, once you see all these different scenarios or different perspectives on sharpening people use, you'll learn that you just want to keep sharpening low. Texture and clarity and stuff, it's kind of style decisions. Denoise is a little bit of a style, how silky smooth you want your photo to look. And grain definitely affects the sharpness and look of your image a lot. But don't try to make up for sharpness in Lightroom. Much more natural looking sharpness if you're able to do it in camera. Most of the time, like the guest editors, if it's nailed focus, they do zero sharpening in Lightroom because it just gives a digital look. And then once you just know how to operate your camera, you have to start to understand how to shape the look of your image. You might see something really impressive in front of you, but when you take the photo doesn't resemble how great it looks in person because you haven't learnt how to create depth in the lens. Need to know why you are choosing these settings to fit and get the shot you want. And this sort of stuff took me way too long to learn. Okay, so there's a few other things that you need to know about aperture, how it affects your image. We'll go over lots of examples. As you can see here, this is exposure, controlling the light to expose your image, which we have pretty much covered. But aperture, this is all aperture. So ISO and shutter are kind of simple. There's not too many interlinking effects, but aperture it's affected by a lot because all of this is about light exposure, and then aperture, the look of your image, is affected by these other things that we'll cover. The goal with aperture, blurry background, is to enhance the subjects in your image to create depth. Depth is what makes an image look very appealing. To help guide the eye, eliminate some distractions, the right attention to your subject. You're not making it too blurry, your image doesn't feel flat, and it feels like quite dynamic. So we'll go over the choice of these settings to get the look that you want to your image and how it changes. It really changes your choice and your settings. But now we're no longer talking about exposure, we're talking about the look of your image. So focal length and distance from the camera play a really big role in the look of your image. So proximity is just how close something is to the camera. So the closer the subject gets to the camera, the blurrier the background if the focal length and the aperture stay the same. Just the subject comes closer to the camera, the blurrier the background. So this has a big impact on the look of your image. Yeah, this is a really cool image. So we have 24mm, which means not that much depth of field, but we're shooting at 1.4, so there'll be a really blurry background. And then we have a very close proximity to the camera, so we're getting a lot of this. So we've got this to this, and that is why we got so much depth here, especially because of this one. And because of this one. And 24mm, not so much. So F's 6.3 is a very good choice, I think, for this image, because we've got some foreground, we have the main subject, and we have the background here. So probably the foreground, midground, and then the background. So these two are very close to each other, and then the background is so far away. So we want to see the background here. So to get this in focus and sharp, and we don't want this completely blurry, so we need a high aperture to get everything in focus. We still get a bit of blur here on this foreground because it's very close to the camera. So we're shooting at 6.3, which is, your whole image should be in focus, but there's still quite a bit of blur to the foreground here. And that's because it's so close to the camera. It's getting a lot of this effect, where if you're close to the camera, there is less depth of field, the background gets blurrier. Very close to the camera, that's why this is blurry. And then we've got the subject here. So this is foreground, subject, and then background. And the focus is here. And I just think this is a really good choice of aperture, because the background is still not very blurry. I think it's good to have this amount of detail for the background. It still looks nice. So we're at 33mm. So we got here, and then we're at 6, and then we are very close to the foreground. So this is very close to the camera, so you get a lot of this effect. So the blurriness, the depth to your image, the blurry background, depth of field is a combination of a result of these three. But I think this one's the most confusing to try to get your head around, because this chair is quite blurry, but the mountains back here are not that blurry, and it's because of proximity to the focus point and to the camera. So this chair is very close to the camera, where this is the background. So this is getting a lot of this effect, where this chair is getting a lot of this effect. And I think in general, I think this was a good choice of aperture to show the right amount of depth in this image. This image definitely has foreground, and then midground, and then background, and you want the right amount of blur to your background. So you want to choose the right aperture that best suits this image. So yeah, we're at 22 millimeters, so you get not much blur to your background. And then we're at Aperture 3.5, so a little bit of softness, not too much softness, but then we have a lot of proximity to the camera for the foreground, so that's why this ends up quite blurry. And then we have the subject, and then we have the background as well. So I think this is a really good choice of settings, because I think if it was shot at f1.4 or even 2.8, I think the foreground would have been too blurry. I think the background would have looked okay, but I think this is a really nice balance of directing the eye using aperture as a tool to create depth in your image. Okay, so I think this is another really good choice of settings. So we're at 50 millimeter, and the more zoomed in you are, the blurrier the background. So we're in the middle here. We get a pretty good amount of blur because of the 50, and then we're at 3.5, which is also in the middle there. And then we are pretty close to the subject. So there's a lot of proximity to the subject, so the focus is now about this long, which is good. We want all of this in focus, because that's the main thing in the subject. So I think 2.8 would have been too shallow. So we've got something like this, and then this is very blurry because of the proximity. And yeah, I just think this is another really good example of a good choice of settings. Okay, so this is a different kind of example. Everyone kind of shoots landscapes up around here. So this is sort of where you usually shoot landscapes, but this landscape is shot at 2.8. Everything in this image is pretty in focus. Come down here. It's all in focus pretty much. And the reason it works is because, so we've got 2.8. We are shooting at 60, so that's also will give a blurry background. So we've got two settings here that will give a blurry background, but then this is so far away from the camera, so we have an effect like this, proximity to the camera, and then we get no blur to the background. This very in focus, and then also this has a little softness to it. So these are kind of close to each other, but there's a big gap between the camera and the first subject midground. So yeah, 2.8 is okay for some landscapes, depending on the proximity of where you're focusing.
And I'm gonna accentuate the light coming from this side.
So another landscape at 2.8, so we've got the focus point about here, and because it's in between, so I'd say we definitely have foreground a midground and a background. And since the focus point is here, this isn't too blurry, and then this isn't too blurry either, because it's in between them, the focus point is. And then we're shooting really wide, so we don't get too much of the effect of compression. And then 2.8, this is another example of 2.8 being used for landscapes.
I double checked the email just to be sure.
And I also really like this one, 2.8, just focusing on the subject there, getting a nice amount of softness to the foreground and up here. It all adds to the main subject nicely. And if it was F4, it would be just taking less emphasis off the middle. I think F2 is a really good choice. Okay, so as you can see, we have all this motion blur here for the bike. We're at 16 mil, so that's up here. That's so everything here is in focus. Okay, so all the way, the clouds are very sharp because they're very far away, and this blur to the road and to the grass is from motion blur and not the depth of field. So, and the reason this has to be so high is because when you lower your shutter speed like this, it's going to be a lot of light. Lots of light is getting into the camera, so therefore you have to shoot up here to get less light, and then you'll also put your ISO up here to get less light to expose your image correctly, because so much light comes through the camera here. So another example at 50, so it's getting kind of slow, especially for a bike, so there's a little bit of a blur. We're at F16 again because there is so much light coming through when you're shooting at low shutters, lots of light. So you have to balance it, and then we're at a very low ISO again, because otherwise there would be too much light coming through the low shutter. This one's super interesting to look at. So we've got a shutter of 250, and you can see that's exactly when things start to get a bit blurry with the bird there. So 2.8 is really nice for the depth to the image. Yeah, it's quite a dark, cloudy day, so we can shoot quite open, and then that shutter is still considered pretty fast, but just not bird's wings fast. Okay, so this one's really interesting. So 1.4, we're gonna have a lot of blur, and then 50 is pretty zoomed in. That's gonna create quite a bit of compression and less depth of field, blurry background. But then we're also very close to the subject, so we're very close, and then so that magnifies the blurriness, and you can see that there's a really strong fall off to the subject, and the eye is in focus. So we're pretty close, and that's why we get so much blur. But if the person with the camera took some steps back, perhaps the whole face or the whole subject would be in focus, not just the eye. So not all images have lots and lots of depth. This image just has one strong subject, so we're at F11. No blur to this one. We're at 23, so that's also going to give very little blur. And then we're kind of close to the subject, but there is no depth to the image to begin with, so we're not going to see anything in this image. It's just interesting to see F11, but there is no depth, so would rather just get a really sharp image than go for a little bit of softness back here. So I think the aperture is a good use for these two images. So the focus point for this one is here, but as you can see, shot at 2.8. So that gives a softness. It really highlights makes it easier to see how long this is, because it slowly gets blurrier and blurrier. And I think it actually helps. Really interesting, like most people might shoot at f16 down here. Shooting down the street, I think this is a good use of 2.8 and 70mm and focusing here. Because I think if you shot at, say, f16 and had everything in focus, I think the subjects would be a little lost. And also the compression of 70 really highlights how long the street is. So commonly everyone is shooting landscapes at f16 or such, but here's 2.8, here's 3.2. These have really strong foregrounds, and I just think the foreground, if it was sharp, if this tree was sharp, it would be very distracting, but it's just got the right amount of blur to not be overly distracting towards the main subject. And we're shooting pretty wide, so yeah, there's still lots of detail you can see from subject to background. And then I think 3.2 is a really nice balance of blurring out this busy foreground. We still want the foreground because it adds depth to the image, but we just don't want it overly strong. It'll become really distracting because it's so busy. So just a bit of creaminess from the 2.3. I think it just really nicely enhances the main subject, but this isn't too blurry, and then this isn't too blurry either. Good use of 3.2. Almost a landscape shot, so 1.4, interesting choice, but it gives a nice softness to the background and really highlights the subjects, but it's not too, the background's not too soft. I think it's a good choice of aperture. It's shot at 35 and we are quite far away from the subjects. There isn't that much blur, so we've got a lot of this, bit of this effect, and then we are kind of up here as well. So that leaves us with just like a nice softness to the background. I like this choice of 3.6, so I think the focus point is here, and then there's just a very soft, little bit of softness here, so we can kind of guide our eyes to the other subjects. Probably could have like had the ability to shoot higher because we could have lowered the shutter, but I think this is a nice aperture for 35mm and like a foreground, midground, and a background. So understanding all this will put you in the best position to start editing. You'll get higher quality photos, and I find now in Lightroom is where everyone is getting their style to their images nowadays. So now you can really push and pull the colors and give the unique style you want in Lightroom. Catch you in the next one.